A gold cane standing alone in a field of white cotton was the only thing left of him. Thomas Mallory, a man who owned 1,000 acres and 100 souls, had walked into the twilight and never returned. His wife believed him dead. The overseer cried murder, but the field hands whispered a different story. A tale of two shadows, tall and silent, moving together toward a horizon no one else could see. They said one was the master, the other his slave. But on that night, in the endless rows of cotton, the lines blurred and they became something else entirely. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The air on the grand veranda of Bel Rêve was as heavy and sweet as honeyed poison. It was the late afternoon of an autumn day in 1845, and the scent of the last magnolias mingled with the oppressive humidity that clung to the Mississippi landscape like a shroud. From her wicker chair, Eleanor Mallory watched her husband. Thomas stood at the edge of the porch, his powerful frame silhouetted against the bruised purple and orange of the descending sun. He was dressed, as always, in impeccable linen, a stark figure of wealth and command, yet a profound weariness haunted the lines of his face and clouded his eyes. His movements were precise, almost ritualistic, as he prepared for the daily walk that had become his only solace. He checked the watch in his waistcoat, adjusted the fit of his jacket, and took up the gold-tipped cane that leaned against the railing. The setting sun caught the polished head of the cane, making it glint with a brilliance that seemed almost alive. Eleanor felt a familiar knot of concern tighten in her chest. The distance between them had grown from a crack to a chasm in recent months, a silent, yawning space she no longer knew how to cross. The creak of her chair as she shifted was the only sound that broke the thick stillness. "Will you be long, my dear?" she asked, her voice softer than she intended. "A storm is gathering in the west." Thomas did not turn to her. His gaze was fixed on the endless sea of white cotton, a kingdom he owned but seemed to despise. "The cotton needs walking," he replied, his voice distant, hollowed out. "It settles the mind." He spoke the words like a catechism, a phrase repeated so often it had lost all meaning, yet he clung to it. It was a compulsion she could not understand, a pilgrimage he made every evening into the heart of his own gilded prison. She watched him descend the steps, the tap of his cane against the stone path, a lonely, rhythmic beat. A sense of foreboding, cold and sharp, washed over her, as inescapable as the coming storm. As Thomas reached the edge of the main cotton field, the great bell began to toll, its deep clang signaling the end of the workday. Figures emerged from between the rows, their shoulders stooped, their movements slow and exhausted. Elias Thorne, the overseer, stood near the path, his arms crossed over his barrel chest. A cruel, ambitious man with a permanent sneer etched into his features, he watched Thomas approach with an expression of simmering resentment. Thorne's authority was absolute in the fields, but it was a borrowed power, and the master's presence always seemed to diminish him. Thomas gave the overseer a curt, dismissive nod, his attention already moving past him. His gaze settled for a moment on Daniel Carter, an enslaved man in his late 30s who was finishing his work near the path. Daniel was tall and powerfully built, but it was the quiet dignity in his posture and the sharp intelligence in his eyes that Thorne found so infuriating. As Thomas's eyes met his, Daniel returned the look for a brief, charged second. It was not the gaze of a slave to a master. There was no fear or deference in it. It was a flicker of profound shared understanding, an acknowledgement that passed between them like a secret current. Then just as quickly Daniel lowered his head, his focus returning to the cotton basket at his feet. The exchange, though fleeting, did not escape Thorne's notice. He spat a stream of dark tobacco juice onto the earth, dangerously close to Daniel's bare feet. "The master fancies his walks," Thorne muttered to a nearby field hand, his voice a low, venomous drawl. And he fancies his pets. The comment was a stone thrown into a still pond, planting a seed of suspicion and jealousy that had long been taking root in the overseer's black heart. Thomas, oblivious or indifferent to the overseer's malice, stepped off the path and into the first row of cotton, beginning his solitary journey into the twilight. The world immediately transformed. The open expanse of the plantation vanished, replaced by a rustling, whispering corridor of green leaves and white bowls. The cotton plants were tall this time of year, standing well above a man's head, creating a disorienting maze-like effect. The only sound was the soft brush of cotton against his clothes and the steady, rhythmic tap of his cane on the damp earth. The setting sun, now low on the horizon, pierced through the dense foliage in sharp, angular shafts, casting long, distorted shadows that danced and writhed like spectral figures. With every step, Thomas felt the suffocating weight of his life press in on him. He saw Belle Reve not as the symbol of prosperity and legacy his father had intended, but as a prison. It was a prison built of suffocating tradition, of polite, meaningless conversations in stuffy parlors, and above all, of the profound and unforgivable sin of human suffering. His thoughts, which had been a chaotic storm for months, now settled into a single, focused point of determination. He thought of a promise made in the dead of night, a debt of the soul that he was finally prepared to pay. His mind was filled with images not of ledgers and crop yields, but of maps, of constellations, and of the cold, clear air of the north. This was not just a walk, he knew with a chilling certainty. This was an act of departure. He was walking away from the man he was, from the life he had inherited, from the gilded cage that had slowly crushed his spirit. The sky, visible only in a narrow strip above the cotton rows, bled from a fiery orange into a deep, bruised purple. The air grew still and heavy, charged with the electricity of the approaching storm. The world seemed to be holding its breath, and in the closing darkness, Thomas Mallory walked on with a sense of finality, his purpose as clear and hard as the gold on his cane. Hours passed. The bruised purple of the sky had turned to an absolute starless black. The storm, which had been a distant threat, broke with the sudden fury of a cannonade. A flash of lightning illuminated the grand house, and in the same instant a deafening crack of thunder shook the windows in their frames. Rain began to fall, not in drops but in solid, driving sheets. On the veranda, Eleanor paced, her elegance stripped away by raw, frantic worry. She wrung her hands, her gaze fixed on the impenetrable wall of darkness where the fields began. He should have been back long ago. He knew the signs of the weather. He would have sought shelter. "Find him!" she cried, her voice thin against the roar of the wind and rain as Elias Thorne and a handful of house servants gathered on the porch. He must have taken shelter somewhere in the fields. Thorne's expression was a mask of grim satisfaction. "He's out there," he said, his voice carrying easily over the storm's din. "Or what's left of him." He paused, letting the cruel implication hang in the air before adding the final venomous stroke. "And that boy Daniel, he's gone too. Vanished right after the bell. Didn't show for evening rations." A search party was hastily assembled. Men grabbed lanterns, their flames sputtering and dancing wildly in the wind, casting bobbing, frantic circles of light that did little to pierce the overwhelming darkness. They moved into the fields, their shouts of Master Thomas swallowed by the thunder. The lanterns looked like fireflies, tiny and helpless in the vast black storm-lashed expanse. The rain was a deluge, turning the rich soil into a thick, sucking mud, washing away any possible tracks, erasing any sign of what had happened. The search was chaotic, desperate, and ultimately utterly futile. They called his name again and again, but only the thunder answered. The storm passed as abruptly as it had arrived, leaving behind a world washed clean and eerily silent. Dawn broke across the Mississippi sky, a fragile watercolor of pink and gray casting a cool, impartial light on the sodden fields of Belle Reve. The search party, a haggard collection of field hands and house servants, reassembled at the edge of the cotton. Their clothes were caked in mud, their faces etched with exhaustion and a lingering fear. Led by Elias Thorne, whose own frustration had curdled into a kind of righteous fury, they fanned out once more into the labyrinth of cotton rows. The air, stripped of its oppressive humidity, was now crisp and smelled of wet earth and crushed greenery. Water dripped from every leaf and bowl, a constant, gentle percussion in the profound stillness. The search felt different now, the frantic hope of the night replaced by a grim, methodical duty. They were no longer looking for a man, but for a body. They moved slowly, their boots making sucking sounds in the thick mud, their eyes scanning the ground for any sign, a torn piece of fabric, a displaced stone, anything to break the maddening uniformity of the landscape. It was a young field hand named Samuel who saw it first. He had stopped to wipe the sweat and mud from his brow, his gaze sweeping absently over the row ahead. Then he froze. A single unnatural glint of light had caught his eye, a flash of gold where there should only be the dark soil and white cotton. He squinted, taking a hesitant step forward. There, in the precise center of the row, stood Thomas Mallory's cane. It was perfectly upright, plunged a few inches into the soft, rain-soaked earth as if placed by a steady and deliberate hand. The morning dew clung to its polished mahogany shaft, and the ornate gold head, fashioned in the shape of a coiled serpent, seemed to watch them with inert, metallic eyes. Samuel let out a choked cry, a sound that was quickly swallowed by the vastness of the field. The other men converged on the spot, their weary trudging turning into a clumsy, urgent run. They formed a silent circle around the cane, a collective breath held in their lungs. The ground around it was a mess of mud and trampled leaves from the storm, but there were no signs of a struggle, no scuff marks, no blood. It was this placid stillness that was most unnerving. This was not the chaotic aftermath of a violent attack. It felt like a marker, a monument. Thorne pushed his way to the front, his eyes narrowing as he took in the scene. He stared at the cane, a muscle twitching in his jaw. It was a statement, a final arrogant gesture, and in his mind the author was clear. The eerie silence that had fallen over the men was broken by his harsh, grating voice. "He was here," Thorne declared, pointing a thick finger at the cane. "This is where that devil Daniel struck him down." Sheriff Brody arrived at Belle Reve before noon, his buggy kicking up mud on the grand, sweeping drive. He was a practical, world-weary man in his 50s with a sun-creased face and eyes that had seen too much of human folly to be easily swayed by hysteria. He found Eleanor Mallory in the main parlor, a room that now felt cavernously empty. She was pale and sleepless, dark circles like bruises beneath her eyes, but she held herself with a rigid, aristocratic composure. She had dressed in mourning black, a stark contrast to her pale skin, and she looked less like a grieving wife than a queen surveying a lost kingdom. Elias Thorne was with her, pacing restlessly before the cold fireplace, his boots soiling the expensive rug. He was bursting to share his version of events, his eagerness a foul taste in the air. As soon as the sheriff had offered his condolences, Thorne launched into his narrative. "It's plain as day, Sheriff," he began, his voice full of self-importance. "The slave, Daniel, he was insolent, had ideas above his station. Master Mallory was too soft on him, treated him more like a confidant than property. Daniel saw his chance in the storm. He knew the master carried a purse for small expenses. He killed him for whatever coin he had on him, hid the body where it'll never be found, and ran. He's probably halfway to the river by now, looking for a boat north. Sheriff Brody listened patiently, his gaze never leaving Thorne's face, though he occasionally flicked a glance toward Eleanor, gauging her reaction. When the overseer finally finished, breathless with his own conviction, the sheriff took a long moment before speaking. He turned his full attention to Eleanor, his voice calm and methodical. "Ma'am," he said gently, "did your husband have any enemies? Any business dealings gone sour? Anyone in Natchez who might wish him harm?" Eleanor met his gaze, her own eyes clear and steady, though it took a supreme act of will to keep them so. "My husband was respected, Sheriff," she replied, her voice a low, controlled murmur. "He was a pillar of this community." She paused, choosing her next words with infinite care, planting a seed of doubt she hoped would grow. "He has been melancholic of late, distant. He carried a great weight on his shoulders, the burden of this enterprise." She gestured vaguely, encompassing the house, the fields, the entire world of Bel Rêve. He was not the sort to make enemies, but he was a man lost in his own thoughts. Two narratives now hung in the opulent parlor, stark and opposing. There was Thorne's simple, brutal tale of murder and escape, an explanation that satisfied the grim logic of their world. And then there was Eleanor's, a more complex and unsettling portrait of a husband's mysterious depression, a man who may not have been taken but had simply wandered away. For now, Sheriff Brody remained carefully neutral, his expression unreadable. He made notes in a small leather book, his methodical scratching the only sound in the room. The official investigation had begun, but Eleanor knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that the truth would not be found in the muddy fields or in the sheriff's careful notes. That evening, a different kind of investigation was taking place in the slave quarters. The air, usually filled with the low murmur of conversation and the sounds of evening chores, was thick with a tense, fearful silence. Thorne and his most trusted drivers had spent the afternoon questioning everyone, their methods brutal, and their questions pointed. Every person was a potential accomplice, every downcast eye a sign of guilt. The community, bound by shared suffering, now felt the added strain of suspicion. Inside one of the small, cramped cabins, Sarah, an older woman whose face was a roadmap of sorrow and resilience, sat with a young field hand named Joseph. Sarah had been a mother figure to Daniel, had known him since he was a boy, and her heart ached with a grief she dared not show. A single candle cast flickering, monstrous shadows on the rough wooden walls. "They won't find him," Joseph whispered, his voice barely audible over the chirping of crickets outside. "Not Master Thomas, not Daniel." Sarah placed a calming hand on his arm, her touch firm. "Hush, boy," she murmured, her eyes darting toward the thin plank door. "Walls have ears, and Thorne's ears are the longest on this plantation." Joseph leaned closer, his young face alight with a mixture of terror and awe. "But I saw it, Sarah. I swear I did." He had been part of the search party, but had lingered at the edge of the woods after Thorne had called them in from the worst of the rain, hoping to find some sign the others had missed. "After the searchers gave up when the rain was still coming down hard, I saw them." He took a shaky breath. Two tall shadows moving through the cotton over by the north field. They weren't running or stumbling, they were walking, together side by side. One was tall like the master, the other tall like Daniel. They just walked into the darkness. Sarah stared at him, her deep, dark eyes searching his. She saw no lie there, only the profound shock of a boy who had witnessed something inexplicable. A legend was being born in that dim, smoky cabin, a story that would be whispered from one to another in the dead of night. A secret kept like a hidden ember, warm and dangerous. It was a story of two shadows, a tale that offered not an answer, but a different kind of question, one that held a sliver of impossible hope. Eleanor could not sleep. Thorne's crude explanation echoed in her mind. So simple, so convenient, and so utterly wrong. She knew her husband. She knew his melancholy was not the prelude to a random act of violence. It was deeper, more profound. And she knew Daniel. She had seen the quiet intelligence in his eyes, the dignity that even the brutality of his existence could not extinguish. He was not a murderer. Unable to bear the suffocating stillness of her bedroom, she rose and, pulling a silk robe over her nightgown, made her way through the sleeping house to Thomas's private study. This room was his sanctuary, the heart of his power. The scent of old leather, pipe tobacco, and paper filled the air. By the light of a single oil lamp, she surveyed his world. The massive oak desk was neatly organized, ledgers stacked, deeds filed, letters answered. On the walls hung maps of the plantation, the neat squares of cultivated land a testament to his family's wealth. This was the business of a plantation owner, the machinery of his kingdom. She ran her hands over his desk, across the spines of his books, searching for something, anything, that could explain the man who would walk into a storm and never return. Her fingers traced the rows of books on the shelves, titles on agriculture, engineering, and law. It was the library of a practical, powerful man. But then, on a lower shelf tucked behind a thick volume on crop rotation, her eyes fell upon a collection of books that did not belong. They were smaller, with worn, simple bindings. She pulled one out. It was a book of poetry by Keats. Next to it was a volume of Rousseau's philosophy. Her confusion mounted. Thomas was not a man for poetry or radical French ideas. Her fingers trembled as she reached behind the row of mundane agricultural texts. There, hidden in the shadows of the bookshelf, was a small stack of pamphlets. She pulled them into the light. The titles seemed to leap out at her, searing themselves into her mind. An appeal to the colored citizens of the world. American slavery as it is. Testimony of 1,000 witnesses. They were abolitionist tracts, fiery, radical, and deeply illegal in this part of the country. Eleanor stumbled back, her hand flying to her mouth as a gasp escaped her lips. The room, once a symbol of her husband's familiar power, suddenly felt alien and dangerous. The man she thought she knew, the man she had loved and lived with for 2 decades, had a secret life. A hidden world of thoughts and ideas that were the antithesis of everything Belle Reve stood for. The discovery was a fissure, a crack in the foundation of her entire world, and through it she saw the first terrifying glimpse of a truth far more complex and dangerous than she could ever have imagined. Her husband's disappearance was not an ending. It was the beginning of a mystery she now had to unravel alone. The abolitionist pamphlets felt like burning coals in Eleanor's hands. Spurred by the shocking discovery, a frantic energy seized her, replacing the listless grief that had clouded her senses for days. If Thomas had hidden these forbidden ideas, what other secrets did this room hold? Her eyes darted to the massive oak desk, his throne, the very epicenter of his life at Belle Reve. She had always seen it as a symbol of his authority, a fortress of ledgers and deeds. Now she saw it as a vault. She remembered the countless hours he had spent there, not always writing, but often just sitting, his gaze fixed on the wall, his fingers drumming a silent, restless rhythm on the polished wood. He had not been managing his estate. He had been plotting a war against it. Her own fingers, trembling slightly, began to trace the intricate carvings that adorned the desk's side panels. They depicted a sprawling magnolia vine, its blossoms and leaves rendered in exquisite, lifelike detail. It was a piece of art, a testament to the craftsman who had built it and the wealth that had commissioned it. To her, it had always been merely decorative, but now she searched it with a new intensity. Pressing every leaf, every petal, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. her thumb pressed into the center of a particularly full, carved blossom near the base. It felt no different from the others, and she was about to move on when she heard it. A faint, almost imperceptible click, the sound of a well-oiled mechanism releasing. She held her breath. A section of the carved paneling, no wider than her hand, slid silently inward, revealing a dark, hollow space, a hidden compartment. A wave of dizziness washed over her, a mixture of terror and vindication. She was a trespasser, about to violate the most private sanctum of her husband's soul. Yet she felt a powerful sense of justification. This was her right. She had a right to know the man she had married. Reaching into the darkness, her fingers brushed against cool, supple leather. She drew out the object. It was a journal, bound in dark brown leather, its cover worn smooth with handling. It was heavy in her hands, heavy with the weight of unspoken thoughts and clandestine actions. The scent of old leather and dry ink rose to meet her, the ghost of her husband's presence. This was it. This was the key. With the journal resting on the polished surface of the desk, Eleanor hesitated for a long moment, the lamplight casting a warm glow on the unmarked cover. Opening it felt like the true and final violation, a step from which there was no return. But the alternative, to live forever with the gnawing uncertainty, with Thorne's ugly narrative as the only epitaph for her husband, was unbearable. She took a deep breath and opened the book to the first page. The handwriting was Thomas's, the familiar, elegant script she knew from household notes and business letters, yet the words themselves were those of a stranger. The entry was dated 2 years prior, long before she had noticed the deepening of his melancholy. She began to read, and the world she knew began to dissolve. A voiceover deep and resonant with a pain she had never heard in his spoken words seemed to fill the silent room. "I have inherited a kingdom built on chains," the entry began. "I host governors and dine on porcelain, while the very foundation of this house, of this life, rests on the backs of men and women whose names I am expected to forget, as if they were no more than the livestock in the fields. It is a gilded cage, and the gold is beginning to feel like lead, poisoning my very soul. I am suffocating in the sin of my inheritance." Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth, a silent gasp catching in her throat. The great weight she had spoken of to the sheriff was not the burden of enterprise, it was the crushing burden of his own conscience. She read on, her eyes devouring the words. "Today I spoke at length with Daniel, not as master to slave, a fiction I can no longer abide, but as one man to another. He was repairing a fence near the cypress grove, and I stopped. We did not speak of his work or of the weather. He asked about the stars, not the foolish stories we tell of them, the bears and the hunters, but their true names, the ones sailors use to navigate the vast empty oceans. I find he has a mind sharper, a curiosity more profound than any I have encountered in the stifling parlors of Natchez. To keep such a mind in bondage is a crime against God and nature." Eleanor sank into her husband's leather chair, the journal held tightly in her hands. The man she had mourned was a phantom, a construct of wealth and tradition. The real Thomas Mallory, the man who existed in these hidden pages, was a stranger to her. Her grief for the husband she had lost began a slow, painful transformation into a complex, breathtaking awe for the man she had never been allowed to know. Over the next several nights, the study became Eleanor's sanctuary and her torment. Sleep offered no respite, so she sat in the deep hours of the night, the rest of the house silent and dark, and consumed her husband's secret life. The journal entries, written sporadically at first, then with increasing frequency and urgency, chronicled the astonishing evolution of a forbidden friendship. She read of how Thomas, under the cover of darkness, began to teach Daniel to read and write. Their classroom was a secluded corner of the barn, their tools a piece of charcoal and a broken slate, their texts the very abolitionist pamphlets she had found. A journal entry from 18 months prior painted the scene. Daniel learns with a ferocious speed, Thomas wrote, his script alive with a strange new energy. He devours books as a starving man devours bread. We have moved beyond the simple alphabet. We read Rousseau and Locke, and he argues with a clarity and passion that would shame the scholars at Harvard. He is not just learning words, he is reclaiming a piece of his own soul. As she turned the pages, the narrative deepened. Thomas's entries became a vessel for Daniel's own story, a story Thomas had clearly sworn to preserve. She learned of Daniel's wife, Rose, and his young son, Marcus, who had not died, as was often assumed, but had been sold to a brutal sugar plantation in Louisiana some 5 years prior. The sale had been part of settling the previous owner's debts, a transaction of human lives recorded with cold indifference in a ledger she could likely find in this very room. He speaks of his wife and son with a resolve of cold iron, another entry read. He does not weep, for I believe he has no tears left. He simply states their names, Rose and Marcus, as if the words themselves are a vow. He told me tonight, his voice low and steady as the river, that he will not die a slave. And I, his master, find I can no longer be his jailer. A plan is forming in my mind, a desperate, mad, and righteous plan. It is a sin to own a man, but perhaps a greater sin to do nothing to set him free. The final pieces of the puzzle began to click into place. Eleanor remembered Thomas's sudden decision to sell off several small remote parcels of land to the west over the past year. He had told her, and an infuriated Elias Thorne, that the soil was poor and the plots were not worth the effort of cultivation. Thorne had called him a fool. Now Eleanor understood. He had been systematically liquidating his assets, amassing a hidden reserve of cash, a war chest for the righteous plan he was forming with Daniel. The motive was not murder, it was a meticulously planned collaborative escape. The final entries of the journal were written in the week leading up to the disappearance. The tone was different, the elegant script tighter, more urgent. The philosophical musings were gone, replaced by the stark, practical details of their conspiracy. The escape was planned for the night of the first autumn storm, a natural accomplice that would wash away their tracks and sow chaos, providing the perfect cover for two men to vanish from the face of the earth. And the cane, the beautiful ornate symbol of Thomas's status, was not just a walking stick. It was the linchpin of the entire operation. Eleanor's hands trembled as she read the last full entry, written on the very afternoon of his disappearance. "The cane will be the signal," Thomas wrote, his voice in her mind now clear and resolute. "I will leave it at the rendezvous point in the North Field, the place where Joseph saw the two shadows. It will tell Daniel that I have made it safely away and that the first part of the funds are waiting for him there, buried in an oilskin pouch. From there, we travel not as master and slave, but as partners in a shared venture for freedom. First his, then mine. He will go south to Louisiana to find Rose and Marcus. The money is for their passage, or if it comes to it, their purchase. I will go north to Philadelphia, where I have made contact with the society. I will await him there to provide the rest of the funds needed to secure his family's freedom if it can be bought. If not, we will fund their passage to Canada, to a place where they can live as a family under their own names in their own home. The cane, the very symbol of my unearned wealth and oppressive power, will be the key to undoing it all. It is the only justice I can offer." Eleanor closed the journal. The silence of the room was absolute. Tears streamed down her face, hot and silent. They were not tears of grief for a lost husband, but tears of pride for the man he had chosen to become. He was not dead. He was a revolutionary. He had sacrificed his name, his home, his entire existence for a principle, for a single family. And she, Eleanor Mallory, the mistress of Belle Reve, was now the sole keeper of a secret so profound, so dangerous, that it could get them all killed. Her world had not just cracked, it had shattered, and in its place was a new and terrifying reality. She was no longer just a wife, she was an accomplice. The journal's pages became a portal. As Eleanor read, the ink dissolved, and the study around her faded away, replaced by scenes that flickered into life, born from her husband's elegant, tormented script. She was no longer in the present, but adrift in the past, a silent witness to the birth of a rebellion. It began in a secluded barn, a year before the disappearance. The air was thick with the smell of dry hay, horse sweat, and the damp earth floor. A single lantern hung from a rusty nail, casting huge dancing shadows that turned the familiar space into a cathedral of secrets. Thomas stood beside a stack of dusty harnesses, a piece of charcoal in one hand and a broken piece of slate in the other. Across from him, Daniel stood with his arms crossed, his powerful frame tense, his face a mask of deep, wary suspicion. He had been summoned here on a moonless night with no explanation, an act that could mean anything from a secret task to a summary execution. Thomas laid the slate on an overturned barrel. "A man is not free if his mind is kept in a cage," Thomas said, his voice low and steady, yet carrying an intensity that made the air vibrate. He pushed the charcoal across the barrel's surface. "This is the key. Do you want it?" Daniel did not move for a long time. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, searched Thomas's face, looking for the trick, the trap. He saw none. He saw only a desperate sincerity, the look of a man just as trapped as he was. His gaze dropped to the charcoal, the simple tool that held the power to unlock the world. His voice, when he finally spoke, was a low, intense rumble, filled with the pain of a lifetime of enforced ignorance. "I want to read the names of the stars you spoke of," he said, the words coming out in a rush of pent-up desire. "I want to read the bill of sale that took my wife from me on a piece of paper. I want to read the word freedom and know its shape." He reached out and took the charcoal. His large, calloused hand, a hand made for picking cotton and breaking soil, held the fragile stick with an almost reverent gentleness. Thomas guided his hand, and in the flickering conspiratorial light of the lantern they drew the first letter. The scratching sound of charcoal on slate was a tiny, defiant sound in the vast silence of the Mississippi night. But to the two men in the barn it was as loud and momentous as a cannon shot. It was the first blow against the walls of their prison. The seasons turned, the secret lessons continued, moving from the barn to the quiet shade of the cypress grove, their bond deepening with every shared word. 6 months before they vanished, Eleanor saw them by a small, meandering creek at the far edge of the plantation. It was a place no one ever went. In her mind's eye, she saw Thomas unpack a parcel of food, not the coarse cornmeal and salt pork of the quarters, but bread, cheese, and smoked ham from the main house kitchen. He laid it out on a clean cloth between them. They ate in a comfortable silence, the gurgle of the creek a soothing counterpoint to the ever-present hum of the fields. The act of sharing a meal so simple and human was in itself a profound rebellion, a dismantling of the brutal hierarchy that governed their lives. After they ate, Thomas unrolled a hand-drawn map, its paper softened and creased from frequent handling. It was a map of the southern states. Daniel leaned over it, his suspicion long since replaced by a focused, burning intensity. His finger, thick and strong, traced the winding path of the Mississippi River down into the boot of Louisiana. "Down here," he said, his voice tight. "They say the sugar plantations are a hell worse than this. They work a man to death in 5 years." He did not need to say her name. rose. Thomas watched him, his expression somber. "I have been selling land," he said quietly. "The western plots. Thorne thinks I'm a fool that the soil is poor." He gave a short, mirthless laugh. "It is, but the money is good." Daniel looked up from the map, his eyes locking with Thomas's. The question was there, sharp and direct. "Money for what?" Thomas met his gaze without flinching. The time for secrets between them was over. "For passage," he said, his voice barely a whisper, yet the words landed with the force of a physical blow. "For a journey." In that moment by the quiet creek, the dynamic shifted irrevocably. This was no longer a master bestowing a gift upon a slave. This was a funded operation. They were partners, strategists, two generals planning a campaign against an empire, with a hand-drawn map as their battlefield and a small hidden purse of gold as their arsenal. The alliance, forged in secret, was destined to erupt into the open. 3 months before the disappearance, the confrontation came. Eleanor pictured it vividly, the scene painted by Thomas's furious clipped prose in the journal. It was midday, the sun a merciless hammer in the sky. Elias Thorne was in the midst of administering discipline. A young boy, no more than 12, had dropped a basket of cotton, and Thorne was laying into his back with a leather whip. The boy's thin cries swallowed by the vast, indifferent fields. Other workers kept their heads down, their faces blank. A practiced defense against a horror they were powerless to stop. But Daniel was different. He dropped his own basket and walked calmly toward the scene. He did not say a word. He simply stepped between Thorne and the boy, turning his own broad back to the overseer. The whip, intended for the child, cracked across Daniel's shoulders, leaving a dark, instantly bleeding weal on his homespun shirt. Daniel didn't flinch or cry out. He simply stood there, a silent, immovable wall of defiance. At that moment, Thomas arrived, riding his stallion, his face a mask of thunder. He dismounted before the horse had even come to a full stop. "Thorne," he said. His voice was dangerously quiet, a quiet that promised a violence far worse than the overseer's loud brutality. "Put down the whip." Thorne, caught off guard, sputtered, his face flushing a deep, mottled red. "This is my right. This boy needs discipline, and this one," he gestured contemptuously at Daniel, "needs to learn his place." Thomas took a slow step forward, his shadow falling over both the overseer and the man he was protecting. "His place is where I say it is," Thomas stated, his voice like chips of ice. "And your place is to obey my orders. You will not lay a hand on Daniel again, or any person on this plantation without my express permission. Is that understood?" The challenge was absolute. Thorne, his authority publicly stripped away, could only stare, his eyes burning with a hatred so pure it was almost palpable. He slowly lowered the whip, his knuckles white. The public declaration was a seismic event. It cemented Thorne's murderous hatred, but it also solidified the alliance between Thomas and Daniel in the eyes of every enslaved person who witnessed it. It was a line drawn in the soil of Bel Rêve, and everyone knew which side the master had chosen. The final flashback was the most painful for Eleanor to witness, for it was the end of her husband's life as she knew it. It was the afternoon of the disappearance, in the very cotton row where the cane would later be found. The air was heavy and still, the sky to the west a bruised, ominous yellow. Thomas and Daniel worked near each other, their movements slow and deliberate, their heads bent as if inspecting the bowls. To anyone watching from a distance, they were simply master and slave discussing the coming harvest. But their low, urgent words were about a different kind of harvest altogether. "The storm will be here by nightfall," Daniel murmured, his eyes scanning the horizon. "The signs are right, the air feels hollow." Thomas nodded, not looking at him. "Everything is in place." The first part of the money is buried in an oilskin pouch beneath the old lightning-scarred cypress by the river. You know the one." He paused, pulling a bowl and examining it with feigned interest. "The cane will mark the spot where I leave the second part, here in the North Field. It will be enough for your journey south to Louisiana. Enough to start." Daniel's hand stilled for a fraction of a second. "And you?" he asked, the question hanging in the thick pre-storm air. "I will travel north," Thomas replied, his voice steady despite the cataclysmic nature of his words. "I have contacts in Philadelphia, people who can help, abolitionists. They are expecting me." He finally turned to look at Daniel, his gaze direct and filled with a solemn, unbreakable promise. "I will wait for you. Send word through the channels we discussed. We will find them, Daniel." He said the names like a prayer. "Rose, Marcus, we will bring your family back together." It was the final vow, the culmination of 2 years of secret planning, shared knowledge, and forged trust. The two shadows that the boy Joseph would later see walking side by side were born in that moment, not from murder or escape, but from a promise. They were two men, from two different worlds, walking together toward a single shared horizon of freedom. The last page of the journal lay open on the desk, but Eleanor's eyes were fixed on the window of the study. The first pale fingers of dawn were stretching across the eastern sky, illuminating a world that was both the same and irrevocably different. The woman who had entered this room days ago, a ghost adrift in a sea of grief, was gone. In her place sat a stranger, forged in the crucible of her husband's secret words. She rose from the leather chair and walked to the large, gilt-edged mirror hanging by the door. The woman who stared back was pale and sleepless, the fine silk of her night robe doing little to hide the sharp new angles of her frame. But the eyes were not the same. The soft, sorrowful haze had been burned away, leaving behind a gaze of cold, clear, and terrifying purpose. The lines of worry on her face no longer looked like weakness. They looked like the hard-won topography of a battlefield. Her husband was not a memory to be mourned. He was a mission to be completed. His legacy was not the sprawling acreage of Belle Reve. It was the radical, dangerous act of rebellion he had committed. She was no longer just a wife. She was an accomplice. Returning to the desk, she picked up the leather-bound journal. She did not read it again. The words were no longer ink on paper. They were etched into her memory, a permanent testament she would carry to her grave. She walked to the grand fireplace where the embers of a low fire still glowed faintly. With a steady hand, she tore out the first page. The paper was thick, expensive, and resisted for a moment before giving way. She held the page covered in Thomas's elegant script over the embers. The corner browned, then curled, and then a small, hungry flame licked up the side, consuming the words. She watched, her face impassive, as his confession about the gilded cage turned to black, fluttering ash. One by one, she fed the pages to the fire. The story of the first lesson in the barn, the shared meal by the creek, the confrontation with Thorne, the final desperate promise in the cotton row. All of it hissed and crackled, turning from a tangible secret into a column of acrid smoke rising up the chimney. It was a ritual of destruction and preservation. She was erasing the evidence, but she was absorbing its power. With every page that vanished, her fear receded, replaced by a resolve as hard and unyielding as granite. When the last page was gone and the cover itself was smoldering in the grate, she stood back. The sun was now fully risen. A new day had begun at Belle Reve, and with it, a new mistress. The plantation office was a small, functional room adjacent to the main house, smelling of ledgers, ink, and Thorne's cheap tobacco. The overseer sat with his muddy boots propped up on the edge of the accounting desk, a position of insolent ownership. He was barking orders at a nervous house servant, his voice oozing a smug authority he had wasted no time in assuming. He believed himself the regent of Belle Rêve, the de facto master until some distant cousin of Thomas's could be located to take over. He did not hear Eleanor enter. She moved with a new, silent grace, her presence a sudden drop in the room's temperature. "Mr. Thorne," she said. Her voice was quiet, yet it cut through his blustering like a razor. Thorne's boots hit the floor with a thud. He turned, a look of annoyance on his face that quickly morphed into a condescending pity. "Ma'am," he said, rising slowly from the chair, "you shouldn't be troubling yourself with these matters. This is man's work. You should be in the house, in mourning." Eleanor advanced into the room, her gaze sweeping over the disarray, the casual disrespect. She stopped on the opposite side of the desk, placing her hands flat on its surface, claiming the space as her own. "I am in mourning for the man I thought my husband was, Mr. Thorne," she replied, her voice as cold and polished as Riverstone. "I am now responsible for the legacy of the man he truly was. From this moment forward, all orders regarding the operation of this plantation, from the planting of the fields to the rationing of supplies, will come directly from me." Thorne let out a short, scoffing laugh. "With all due respect, Mrs. Mallory, you know nothing of running a plantation. It is a complex and often unpleasant business." "I am a faster learner than you imagine," she countered smoothly. "For instance, I have been reviewing my husband's ledgers, his private ones." She let that hang in the air for a moment, watching the confidence drain from Thorne's face. "I see he sold the western plots over the past year. You advised against it, I believe. You thought him a fool for selling what you considered to be poor soil." Thorne's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. He was utterly blindsided. "I will be handling all financial matters from now on," Eleanor continued, pressing her advantage. "Your duties will be restricted to the fields. You will oversee the work and nothing more, and your methods will change." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes locking onto his. "There will be no more use of the whip. Rations will be increased. The workday will end at the second bell without exception, regardless of the task. You will treat the people on this plantation with a measure of dignity, or you will not be on this plantation at all." The color rose in Thorne's thick neck, a tide of impotent fury. He was being dressed down, his power stripped away by a woman he had dismissed as a fragile ornament. He saw in her eyes not the grief-stricken widow, but a formidable and inexplicable new authority. He had lost control, and the realization left him sputtering, his hatred for her, for Thomas, for the memory of Daniel curdling into a poison he had no choice but to swallow. Later that week, under the guise of distributing extra rations, in memory of her late husband's generosity, Eleanor made her way to the quarters. It was a calculated act, her first move as the new ruler of Belle Rêve, and it served two purposes. It was a public demonstration of the new order she had dictated to Thorne, and it was a private mission. The atmosphere in the quarters was still heavy with the fear Thorne's interrogations had instilled. People moved with their eyes downcast, their conversations falling to whispers as she approached. They accepted the offerings of smoked bacon and fresh flour with murmured thanks, but their eyes were wary. Eleanor moved through the small cluster of cabins, her heart aching at the poverty and grim functionality of it all. She was looking for one person. She found Sarah sitting on the steps of her cabin, mending a small shirt. The older woman's face was a mask of stoic endurance, but her eyes held a deep, ancient sadness. Eleanor dismissed the servant who accompanied her and approached Sarah alone. "Sarah," she said softly. The woman looked up, her gaze direct and knowing. She did not stand, an act of subtle defiance that Eleanor respected. "Ma'am," Sarah replied, her voice raspy but strong. Eleanor held out a small cloth-wrapped bundle. It contained not just rations but a jar of healing salve and a length of fine wool fabric. "I wanted you to have this," Eleanor said. She paused, searching for the right words, words that could bridge the impossible gulf between their two worlds. "Daniel was a good man," she began, her voice barely a whisper, meant only for Sarah's ears. "My husband. He respected him." Sarah took the bundle, her gnarled fingers brushing against Eleanor's. She looked at Eleanor, a long, searching look that seemed to peel back the layers of mistress and slave, of white and black, and see directly into her soul. A flicker of understanding, profound and sorrowful, passed between them. "He was more than good, ma'am," Sarah said, her voice low and resonant. "He was a husband and a father. His heart was in another place." She looked away for a moment toward the distant fields. "And Master Thomas, he had a good heart that was trapped in a bad world." It was an absolution and an indictment all in one. In that moment, Eleanor knew she was not alone in her secret. Sarah knew, perhaps not the details of the plan, but she knew the truth of the men. A silent pact was formed on those rickety steps, an alliance of two women from opposite ends of a brutal system, united by their shared knowledge and their desire to protect the legacy of the two shadows who had walked away. That night, while clearing the last of Thomas's personal effects from the study, a task she had undertaken to prevent anyone else from stumbling upon a secret she might have missed, she found it. Tucked inside the book of Keats' poetry, a volume whose presence had once baffled her, was a single folded sheet of paper. It was a letter addressed simply to Eleanor in her husband's hand. Her heart leaped into her throat. This was not a journal entry meant for himself. This was for her. With trembling fingers, she unfolded it. It was a confession, an apology and a plea, his final word reaching out to her from across the void. His voice, the one she now knew from the journal, filled her mind. "My dearest Eleanor," it began. "If you are reading this, then our secret is now yours to keep. I pray you never have to, for it means my own courage failed me and I could not destroy this last link to you. I could not ask you to share this burden while I was planning it, for the risk was too great and the choice was mine alone. But I must trust you with its aftermath. I have chosen a path I know you cannot understand, a path that forsakes my duty to you and to our life. For that I am truly sorry. But it is the only one my soul would allow me to walk. Please know, I have not been taken from you by force, but have gone willingly toward a purpose I believe to be greater than myself, a small act of justice in a world full of injustice." Eleanor had to stop, pressing the letter to her chest as a wave of emotion, a complex mix of love and grief and pride, washed over her. She took a breath and continued reading. "Do not let Thorn poison this place more than it already is. His cruelty is a symptom of the disease that infects us all. The people here, they deserve more than what this life has given them. In my absence, Bel Rev is yours. The ledgers will show you the way. Make it a better place than I did. Make it a place where a good heart is not trapped. Forgive me for the life I could not give you and for the one I have chosen instead. Yours, Thomas." The letter was his blessing. It was his permission, his mandate. It solidified her resolve, transforming it from a reaction to his secret into a partnership with his purpose. She held the fragile paper to her lips, the faint scent of her husband, of ink and tobacco and leather, a final ghostly caress. Her path was now clear. She would not just protect his secret, she would honor his final wish. She would become the mistress of Bel Rev in truth, and from within the belly of the beast, she would begin to dismantle it. A few months had passed since the discovery of the cane, months in which the seasons had turned and the raw wound of the disappearance had scarred over into a local legend. Eleanor chose a crisp, clear morning to make the journey into Natchez. She rode in the main carriage, sitting upright and alone, her hands folded calmly in the lap of her modest dark gray dress. She was no longer the frantic, grieving wife the town had pitied. The woman who arrived at the sheriff's office was composed, her purpose a quiet, unassailable fortress around her. Sheriff Brody's office was a cramped, dusty space that smelled of stale cigar smoke and old paper. He rose as she entered, his expression one of weary surprise. He had not expected to see her again. "Mrs. Mallory," he said, gesturing to a worn leather chair. "This is an unexpected visit." Eleanor inclined her head, foregoing the chair. She preferred to stand, to meet him on her own terms. "Sheriff, I will not take much of your time. I have come to make a final statement regarding my husband." Brody leaned against his desk, his arms crossed. He studied her, noting the absence of tears, the steady clarity in her eyes. This was not the woman he had comforted in the opulent parlor of Belle Rêve. "I have come to accept what has happened," Eleanor stated, her voice even and devoid of emotion. It was a performance of a lifetime, and she would not falter. "My husband, as I told you, was not in his right mind. His melancholy was deeper than I knew. I believe he wandered into the swamp during the storm and was lost to the river. It is a tragedy, but one I must now accept." She paused, letting the words settle in the dusty air. "As for the slave, Daniel, it seems clear he used the confusion of that night to flee. I see no evidence of foul play, no reason to believe he had any hand in my husband's fate beyond his own selfish opportunism. Therefore, I wish for the investigation to be closed." She delivered the final, crucial blow. "I have instructed my lawyer to begin the proceedings to have my husband declared legally dead. It is time for Belle Rêve to move forward." Sheriff Brody was silent for a long moment. He was a man who dealt in facts, in evidence, in the brutal, simple logic of crime and punishment. Eleanor's story was plausible, neat. It tied up all the loose ends. Yet as he looked at the woman before him, at the unyielding strength in her posture, he sensed a story far deeper and more complex than the one she was telling. He sensed the vast, silent weight of things left unsaid. He had been a sheriff long enough to know that some truths were not meant for his ledgers, that some mysteries were better left to the whispers of time. He gave a slow, resigned nod. "As you wish, Mrs. Mallory," he said, his voice softer than he intended. "It's a tragedy, to be sure. Some things, I suppose, were never meant to fully understand." He watched her turn and leave, her back straight, her steps measured. The door closed behind her, and the office seemed darker. The dust motes dancing in the sunlight, suddenly looking like the scattered ashes of a story he would never read. The new order at Belle Rêve did not arrive like a storm, but like a slow, quiet tide. It began with the departure of Elias Thorne. He lasted less than a month under Eleanor's rule. Deprived of his whip and his absolute authority, he was a king without a crown. His power neutered. He chafed under her calm, unyielding commands, her insistence on fair work hours, her quiet audits of his supply requests. The final confrontation happened in the Plantation office, where he accused her of being mad with grief, of running the plantation into the ground with her soft, womanly notions. Eleanor simply listened, her face impassive, and when he was finished with his tirade, she slid his final payment across the desk. "Your services are no longer required, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice as cool and final as a winter morning. He left in a storm of impotent fury, his departure mourned by no one. In his place, Eleanor did not hire another overseer. Instead, she promoted one of the older, more respected enslaved men to act as a foreman, and in a move that sent shockwaves through the local planter society, she began to hire free black laborers to work alongside the enslaved population. They were paid a fair wage, given proper housing, and treated as employees, not property. The lines, once so stark and brutal, began to blur. A field of cotton was now tended by hands that were owned and hands that were free. A quiet, radical experiment that was both a practical necessity and a deep philosophical statement. Using the financial acumen she never knew she possessed, and guided by the secret knowledge from Thomas's ledgers, Eleanor began to wield the profits of Bel Rêve like a weapon against the very system that generated them. She made discreet trips to Natchez, meeting with a Quaker lawyer who asked few questions. With the money from the cotton harvests, she began to buy the freedom of the plantation's most elderly and infirm slaves, those who were considered to have little value left. She did it quietly, one by one, arranging for their transport north with the help of the lawyer's silent network. Bel Rêve was still a plantation, a place of bondage, but under her command it was becoming something else. A place of transition. A slow, secret dismantling of an empire from within, guided by the ghost of her husband's final wish. In the taverns and parlors of Natchez, the truth of Bel Rêve was lost, replaced by a far more romantic and haunting fiction. The story of Thomas Mallory's disappearance became a local ghost story, a cautionary tale told over whiskey on stormy nights. The complex, courageous reality of two men plotting a desperate escape for freedom was whittled down into a simple, supernatural fable. They say on nights when the moon is down and a storm is brewing, you can still see them out in the Mallory fields, one merchant would say, his voice low and theatrical, to a rapt audience in a smoky tavern. Two tall ghosts walking the rows, side by side. Another man, a farmer with hands like gnarled roots, would pick up the tale. One is the master, Thomas Mallory himself, his fine clothes all tattered and torn. The other is the slave who murdered him. The one they call Daniel. They say the devil bound their souls together as punishment for the crime. The legend grew with each telling. Some claim to have heard the faint, rhythmic tapping of a ghostly cane on the wet earth. Others swore they saw the glint of its gold head in flashes of lightning. The public narrative was cemented, a fiction that, in its own ironic way, offered the most profound protection for the truth. The two shadows were no longer men, they were phantoms, their revolutionary act of hope twisted into a grim tale of murder and eternal damnation. The world, unable to comprehend an alliance between master and slave, had created a story it could understand, a story that reinforced its own brutal logic, leaving the real, dangerous truth to rest in peace, known only to a silent woman on a lonely plantation and an old woman in the quarters who knew the truth of a good heart trapped in a bad world. 1 year to the day after Thomas had walked into the twilight, Eleanor sat on the veranda in the same wicker chair where she had last watched him. The oppressive humidity of that long-ago evening was gone, replaced by the gentle, fragrant air of a perfect autumn twilight. She looked out over the cotton fields, a landscape that was once a symbol of her prison but was now the field of her own quiet war. The work was done for the day and the fields were quiet, peaceful. In her lap, her hands held a single sheet of paper, a letter that had arrived that morning. It had not come through the official post. It had been delivered by a free laborer she had hired months ago, a quiet, trustworthy man who had handed it to her with a knowing look and then melted away. The paper was worn, creased and softened by a long journey passed from one secret hand to another. There was no return address, no salutation. It contained only 3 words written in a familiar, elegant script that made her heart ache with a bittersweet recognition. They are free. A wave of profound relief, so powerful it was almost painful, washed over her. It was not the giddy joy of victory, but the deep, quiet satisfaction of a promise fulfilled, a debt finally paid. Thomas and Daniel had made it. Their desperate, mad, righteous plan had succeeded. Her year of silent waiting, of managing the plantation, of fighting her secret war had not been in vain. The sacrifice had been worth it. She closed her eyes, the tears finally coming, not of grief, but of a deep, cathartic release. The setting sun cast a final, golden glow over the fields, the color of hope, the color of the gold-tipped cane that had started it all. As she looked toward the horizon, toward the dark tree line at the edge of the world, she saw two figures far in the distance walking together. It was just two of the field workers, a father and son perhaps, heading home after a long day's work. But for a moment in the fading light, she allowed herself to see them as something more. She saw two tall shadows, moving not as ghosts bound by punishment, but as free men, their shoulders straight, their steps steady, walking together into the sunset, toward a future they had claimed for themselves. The legend was for the world. This truth was for her, and it was enough.